Hi everyone! Today we're going to talk about Yupo paper. So what is Yupo paper? Yupo is a special type of paper made from polypropylene plastic, so material sits on top instead of being absorbed, like in traditional watercolor paper. This means you get a really clear view of the suspension of pigments in your piece, where the color settles, where it marbles with water, and so on, which gives a really incredible depth to your artwork. Today we'll be making an acrylic ink painting, but you can experiment with watercolor, teas, coffee, and more on your own. This is an extremely flexible medium with tons of possibilities. For this project you will need Yupo paper, a watercolor paintbrush, acrylic ink. I am using Antelope Brown from De La Rowney, clean water for washing your brush, separate clean water for mixing with ink, and if you want, a container to put your ink in, and a paper towel. I'm also going to be using a straw and a water dropper to add effects, so you can definitely play around with those if you want to. Make sure you're at a workstation where you can leave your painting to dry undisturbed. Moving your paper may destroy the textures and patterns you've created, so it's important to keep it as still as possible. Before you start, you're going to want to lightly spray your paper with water. My spray bottle is comically large, so I've pre-sprayed my paper. Try not to touch the surface of your paper to avoid fingerprints, which might interfere with the ink. Next, saturate your brush with clean water. You can see I hesitated because I don't want to use the same water I clean my brush with. After you dip your brush in the water, then dip it in the ink. Your colors will appear darker when they're wet than when they're dry, so keep this in mind. I'm going to start by making a couple of dots on my paper. Instantly, you can see this cool splatter effect happening. That's actually because I didn't spray my paper as heavily as I wanted to, so you can see the individual water droplets when the ink hits the paper. All this means is I'll have a little less time to work with my ink before it dries, and I'll have more textures like this than I'll have smooth swirls. Now that I've added some ink to my paper, I'm going to go in with my water dropper. This adds an interesting texture to the ink and gives me more liquid to flow on my paper. Some of the water I sprayed earlier is starting to dry up, so I'm making sure I drop some water on the empty spaces too. Going back in with some ink. Now I'm going to pull out my straw. The straw is cool because it allows you to blow the ink around your paper in a certain direction. You can also blow on your ink without the straw, which will produce a similar effect, but the ink will spread out in more of a circular pattern. I'm going back in with more ink, but this time straight from the bottle. The thing I love about this Antelope Brown color is it looks completely different in different concentrations, so the undiluted pigment is going to add a deep, cool brown to the gold tones we already have. Next is my favorite technique, drawing lines with the back of the brush. This can add a lot of personality to your painting, and is especially useful if you want to evoke a little whimsy or creepiness. It's also useful for dragging some pigment into those empty water spots I dropped on my paper earlier. I try to let the art speak to me with this technique and add lines wherever it feels right in the moment, rather than thinking too hard and planning where they're going to go. A little splatter painting using some ink and water on the brush. I skipped ahead a little bit, but I wanted you to see how the painting changes once you add a thicker layer of water to the paper. You can really see these marbling effects starting to happen, and even though more liquid means longer drying time, I really like the way the pigments look on a wetter surface. Alright, I think I'm satisfied with my painting, so now it's time to let it dry. Here's the finished product. You can see that the colors are actually pretty similar to how they were when they were wet, but there were some color changes that the camera didn't capture. I zoomed into some textures I thought were interesting so you could get a better look at how the ink dries on the Yupo paper. Unfortunately, you can see the shadow of my window screen in the photos, but this was the best lighting I could get for a clear image, and even with all my lights pointed towards the paper, I still got some shadow. In some of the photos, I used a macro phone lens attachment I found online for super cheap, which I absolutely love. The downside to the macro lens is you can see all the pet hair that, despite my best efforts, still stuck to my painting. Although drying can take a long time, Yupo is a really unique work surface that can make incredible pieces with little effort. You can play around with this process a lot. Some popular things to try are alcohol ink, watercolors, India ink. If you want to paint figuratively, start on a dry surface instead of a wet one. You can even try other media like marker, oil pastel, or colored pencil. I like to draw on top of my Yupo paintings. I treat it kind of like cloud watching, looking for shapes in the swirls I can make into figures or even just accentuate with line and color. You can also use your Yupo painting as a background for a collage, another painting, or anything you can think of. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you learned something new today and have fun painting!